Drakengard, and by extension its spin-off NieR, is a series of video games that shouldn't logically exist. They're a bunch of insanely niche action games of questionable quality, with incredibly dense and convoluted storylines spanning across multiple timelines and dimensions. They don't sell very well or get received well critically, they have extremely small budgets, and a ton of performance problems. Yet even after all of this, these games still manage to garner a dedicated following and continue to receive funding from Square Enix of all people. Fans love games by this director, Yoko Taro, because of their art design, music, and dark storylines that deal with bizarre and rarely tackled subject matter. It really is an anomaly of a series, and it's interesting that for how profit-driven the industry is, that Yoko Taro continues to persist despite almost everything going against him. While Drakengard is a series of Dynasty Warriors-esque action games mixed with aerial dragon combat, its spin-off NieR, set in the distant future of an alternate universe discovered in one of the multiple endings of the first Drakengard, is a role-playing game with action and adventure elements. The premise for the game is definitely something else, but it's so far removed from Drakengard that you really don't have to play those games to enjoy NieR. Honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to even tell it was related to Drakengard if someone didn't tell you. Playing them would give you a lot more of an appreciation for the smaller details of the world, but when you get down to it, NieR is its own entity and its own experience. Actually describing the story to this game is a little difficult. It has a really crazy premise to its world with a ton of twists that I don't want to give away, but the main storyline itself is actually pretty simple. The game opens up to a desolate and crumbling Tokyo that appears to be covered in snow. Deep down below the city's now silent skyscrapers resides a father and daughter struggling to stay alive in a now ruined world. Closed in on by dark creatures, the father makes a deal with a book to obtain the means to protect the last person he has to live for. And with that, he's granted unimaginable power, but even that isn't enough to protect his daughter. All alone, he screams out for help, and that's when the game jumps forward 1,300 years into the future. You play as a determined father named NieR, trying his best to take care of his daughter Yona in an increasingly more difficult world. He spends his days doing odd jobs around his village for money to scrape by. The world they live in is oppressive and filled with creatures called shades which seem to attack people at random. Not only that, but people are being stricken with an illness called the Black Scrawl which will eventually claim their lives. Yona is one of the people unlucky enough to fall victim to this disease, and it becomes NieR's life mission to find a cure for it to save her before it's too late. His adventure begins when he meets a floating book with a snarky and condescending personality called Grimoire Vice, who grants him the ability to use magic. According to legend, Vice is to bring harmony back to the world when he has all of something called the Sealed Verses, and NieR thinks this must mean he can cure the Black Scrawl and vanquish the Shades. The two take off to various different locations around the world in search of these Sealed Verses, taking on massive bosses and meeting strange new allies along the way. Exploring the world, learning about its history and the backstories of your allies is one of the highlights of the experience. I know the summary of the story I just gave doesn't sound special at all, but trust me, there is much more to it than I just laid out, and uncovering the truth behind things is one of the main draws. What I will say is that despite being a standard adventure on the surface, it's all handled with a bleakness that you don't normally see. The people of this world are used to living sad lives, so as worse and worse things happen, these characters are able to take it without flinching. At the same time, I do think this is a positive game overall. These characters all have hope for the future, despite the dark situations they're put in. They're willing to put their lives on the line for those they care about, because they want to forge a better future. And if those good intentions wind up killing them, then so be it, because it's not like sitting around waiting for the Shades to get them is a better fate. That's what sets a good story apart from some other nihilistic stories where its writer is just getting off on watching people suffer. There has to be a point to the heartache and a reason to make it out on the other side. At the same time, know that this all comes in the form of a morally ambiguous story. What's positive in one character's perspective is a negative in another's, and your view of what could be considered a positive ending will really be challenged by the time you get to it. It's a very high-stakes story, but it's handled in a very low-key way. It's the type of story where the fate of humanity is decided by a simple fight in a room between two people. And that probably had a lot to do with how low the game's budget was. There aren't that many areas that comprise the game's world, and almost all of them are reused in the second half of the game for new bosses. But it makes up for its small budget by continuing to make things emotionally heavy. It manages to do a lot with so little, and I do find that really commendable, but at the same time that means it does get pretty repetitive. Especially because the game has multiple endings, meaning that if you want all of them, you'll need to replay its second half 4 times total. This is gonna turn a lot of people off, but those who stick with it and get hooked by the story and characters will be more than willing to give it another run through just to learn more. On your subsequent playthroughs, you'll also get more insight into the bosses you've been fighting, which again adds to the gray sense of morality the game has. I made sure to get all of the endings and I'd say it was worth it. What happens after you get ending D is probably the most memorable part of the whole experience. When it comes to the actual combat of the game, it isn't that impressive, but it also isn't offensive by any means. It's sufficiently weighty and your blows feel satisfying. The game has a ton of weapons to collect which fit into 3 distinct classes: one-handed swords, slow two-handed swords, and spears. Then Vice lets you utilize several different types of magic which you can hotkey to the shoulder buttons. These are surprisingly varied, and you'll find yourself switching between magic types depending on what you're facing. So as you can see, the combat is a bit better than just serviceable, and you can actually have some fun with it. It's just that you'll be pulling off the standard attack, dodge routine you've probably experienced many times before. And when things get really hectic with a bunch of enemies on screen, the frame rate will tank, and I think even the resolution will drop below 720p. Boss battles are definitely the highlight of combat, and thankfully there are a good number of them. This is where the combat is elevated from just simple button mashing to actually incorporating some strategy by pitting you against foes with interesting attack patterns. Some fights end up looking more like a bullet hell than a traditional 3D action game, and that's one of the things that gives NieR's boss design its own identity. These bosses are where the game really shines, not only gameplay-wise but also narratively, because these are where the characters are tested the most emotionally. One reason these fights have so much impact is because of how stellar the soundtrack for the game is. In conjunction with some bizarre designs, NieR's soundtrack is able to invoke some really powerful and surreal moments. It manages to be both beautiful and frightening, and the game's best moments wouldn't have half the impact they do if they weren't backed by these hypnotizing tracks. There's a reason I've used so many of these songs in my videos before, and I hope you've been able to pick up on some of it since I've been using it as background music for this video. You wouldn't expect a game like this to have such an amazing soundtrack, but because they had this sort of talent behind them, the experience is improved exponentially. Being like a bullet hell isn't the only way NieR is similar to other types of games. For some reason the game likes to switch things up and pay homage to other game genres. You'll enter an area and all of a sudden the perspective is completely different, or it changes to mimic a survival horror game. There are even 2 areas where it turns into a visual novel, and let's just say this is no Fate Stay Night. It just sort of does what it wants because it was directed by a crazy man who will put anything in his games if he thinks they're cool, regardless of whether or not it makes sense. And like I said before, that's why people love Yoko Taro's games in spite of their problems. NieR was an ambitious title for him to take on. It's an RPG action game hybrid with open level design that combines farming, fishing, and combat against giant monsters with the fate of civilization on the line. But with that ambitiousness came a very flawed game. You need to ask yourself how much jankiness you're willing to deal with in return for a good story. If a game's gameplay is one of the weaker aspects of it, can it still, as a whole entity, be your next favorite? For some people the answer is no, and that's fine. It's all about what you personally appreciate and look for from an experience. This is not the kind of game anyone can pick up and enjoy, but it'll really resonate with the kind of person who finds its exceptional elements to be really appealing. I think the overall message I want to convey with this video is that NieR is not the best looking game or the best playing game by any means. But what it is as a story, as a world, as a creation as a whole is something unique, captivating, and enjoyable. It's flawed on many levels, but what these developers made, persevering until the end to release what they were passionate about despite all odds, is really commendable. I have a lot of respect for this game and its creators. In the same way the people of its world struggle to exist, I can feel the game struggle to exist because of budgetary restraints and developmental problems. But just like the characters of the story, they kept fighting to survive, and their hard work was rewarded with a sequel by Platinum Games titled NieR Automata, which is about to come out. This is a really amazing opportunity for the series. With Yoko Taro manning the story and Platinum handling the gameplay, this is the first real chance this series has to get a great game with no strings attached. This could be a turning point for Yoko Taro's games, where they can be enjoyed by anyone for their great writing and great gameplay. I wish all the luck to them because I want them to succeed, and everything I've seen from Automata looks fantastic. I can't wait to play it, but in the meantime you should really give the original NieR a shot if it looks like your style of game. If you give it a chance, you'll be rewarded with a worthwhile experience, and you shouldn't miss out on that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and more importantly, I hope you enjoy NieR.